more functional for us. And tonight we really have the very good fortune to have a very professional engineer, someone who's intimately involved with engine manufacture, engine design, and the operating of engines. And it's Otto Bonenberger, whom I'm happy to call a friend and a colleague. Now Otto is most importantly president of a company called Elite Engineering Systems, who manufactures all the components for Porsche engines that are used in racing Porsches in 24-hour races, such as the Daytona 24. So the man is incredibly intimately familiar with engines, how they operate, and the pros and cons of how to operate them. Also, it's useful to point out that the Mooney aircraft had for some time been supplying their aircraft with Porsche engines. And so a lot of what Otto knows is also important for aircraft engines. And of course, that's what he's going to focus on for us tonight. And I believe you want it interactive, you want him asking questions as much as possible.
Yeah, well, thank you for the kind words. It's certainly a very nice way. I just thought it made sense to take a little bit of time and understand in a piston engine environment, which is really what we are all going to be flying for some time. I know that at some time some of you guys have some aspirations to move into jets and turboprops and some of these other things, but you know, in the meantime, until we get to that point, we're probably going to be flying behind a piston engine, you know, and most of the engines that are in private or general aviation aircraft today are horizontally opposed air-cooled piston engines. And what I thought may make sense is for us to understand what is it that the engine is telling us, maybe start interpreting some of the signals that the engine is giving us, but most importantly know if the stuff that we're hearing or the stuff that we're seeing or the things that we are hearing, I mean the things that we're maybe observing out the window, if this is something that we should be concerned about or this is something that maybe we shouldn't be concerned about. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk a little bit about, just go back and see what is happening inside of one of these pistons, you know. Sparky has 4 of these things, you know, and why is this stuff happening? And then go into maybe the more practical application, which is a lot of you guys, you know, once you get your private pilots, or if you already have your private pilots, there will be times when you're going to be flying an airplane that you rent somewhere else, and it may be a different brand with a different engine. And believe it or not, it's probably going to have a horizontally opposed engine in it. It's probably going to be air-cooled. So if you understand how particulars go from a mixture control point of view, you should be able to operate that engine just as well as you were operating the one that you're very familiar with in your home field, because you got comfortable with it. You just need to know which parameters to look at. So that's what I wanted to do. And I think it may make sense for anybody that has a question to just interrupt and say, hey, look, I didn't quite get this, or can you just go through this again, or whatever else. Yes, sir, right there.
Otto, why is it that I can get into anybody's car here, get their keys, and just start it and drive it? But it's not so easy with airplane engines. It's so much more cumbersome to run an airplane.
That's an excellent question, and I think that the answer to that is that we have a government agency that's called the Federal Aviation Administration, and they want to make sure that everybody's safe. And as a result of it, any kind of power plant that is going to be certified to be used in a certified, FAA certified airplane needs to go through a certification process that is A, very time consuming, and B, extremely costly. And additionally, anybody that will be servicing general aviation will have a pretty significant liability associated with supplying those products into that market. So what we're flying behind, believe it or not, if you go out there and buy a brand new Cirrus, or you go out there and buy a brand new Bonanza, which you can do, you're flying behind something that is essentially 1940s technology. I call it tractor engines, because that's really, they're more closely related to the 1940s John Deere tractors than they are to the car that you get in today and turn the key and go. So you kind of like have to go back and look at the basics, because way back then you couldn't quite do that, right? You know, in the 1940s you couldn't just go and turn that thing. You had to pull the choke out, and you had to do all these other things. For those of us that have been around for a few more years, we still remember those days. You know? Yeah, I don't know about the crank, but you know, I understand that at the turn of the last century, most drivers had to drive around with a mechanic because you had all these levers to adjust the timing while you were going, etc. So that's the reason why. I mean, many manufacturers are simply not willing to take that risk, so you use the same technology that was available before. So what I want to do then is let's talk a little bit about what is happening inside of an engine. And, you know, so you got a chamber with a cylinder over here, and you have a piston that is going, you know, that is on a pin, and it is on a crank over here. And this piston is going up and down as this crank goes up and down. That's really what is really happening. And then you have some way to get a mixture of something that can burn. And we use gasoline, and we mix gasoline with air. And really what it is you take a hydrocarbon, something that has carbon in it, okay? And you mix it with something that has oxygen in it. And if you have the right temperature and pressure for this carbon and this oxygen to react, then guess what? A chemical reaction will take place. We usually see this in terms of fire, burning, you know. And if that chemical reaction is taking place, the temperature increases, and as the temperature increases, what do you think happens to the pressure? It goes up, right? Okay. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to say, anytime the temperature increases, what happens to the pressure if everything else being equal? The pressure increases as well. Okay? All right. So
I brought you some show and tell.
Very well. Thank you, sir. This is one of those cylinders. Okay, and believe it or not, this piston right here is probably 3 times larger than any piston in your car. So the buns in your car are probably this big. And this piston probably weighs 10 times as much as the piston in a race car. Probably 5 times as much as the piston in your car. And what is happening is this piston is going up and down. And if you see these 2 indentations over here, one of them corresponds to an intake valve, which is essentially a valve that opens up. When this piston is starting to come down here, the intake valve opens up, and the resulting pressure right above the piston is lower. It's not in vacuum. It just decreases the pressure because the void that is left behind this piston reduces the pressure, and therefore the pressure that is acting on this piston from the outside is able to flow stuff into this chamber. Okay, so this piston moves down. As it moves down, you want to get this air and this fuel that is in there, and once it's down in there, you want to close this valve because now it's trapped. You can do something with it. So now what you do is this piston now starts moving back up, and it compresses whatever you trapped in here back into something. Now there's one thing I'm going to do today, which is goes against my grain a little bit, but just in the interest of what we have today, I'm going to make some simplifications, okay? It's not strictly exactly 100% correct from an engineering point of view, but just so that we understand what happens. Anytime you take a gas, whether it's, you know, air or something else, you know, helium, oxygen, nitrogen, or something like that, when you compress this gas, you not only increase the pressure associated with that gas, you also increase the temperature associated with that gas. It's something that follows something that's called the ideal gas law. Okay? So if you have this volume right here with air and fuel in it, and this air and fuel is at whatever atmospheric conditions we're up here. Let's say that the outside temperature is 50 degrees, so the air is going to be 50 degrees, and the fuel is going to be spraying in here. So let's say that the fuel is 50 degrees, and let's just assume for the time being that the heat of vaporization that was required to vaporize the fuel is negligible, which it's not, but let's just assume it is. So that means that this mixture in here is going to be 50 degrees, right? When this piston is at the bottom. Now we close this valve. This valve is now closed. And this piston is going to go up, and we're going to compress this stuff here when it gets to the top. And once it is compressed, now we're going to go ahead and ignite this thing here. Okay? Let's see what happens is when this piston went up. So, as pressure increases, so does temperature. You've got to remember that, because I'm going to go back and keep talking about this thing here. Any combustible mixture regardless of what it is, has a combination of pressure and temperature where the stuff will literally react. It doesn't matter what it is, but it's not unique. It's a combination of pressure and temperature. So if the pressure is low, maybe the temperature needs to be higher. If the temperature is low, maybe the pressure needs to be higher. My point is that you will have a combination where these molecules of, if you have a molecule of, I'm going to make it like this. If these are molecules of fuel and these are molecules of air right there, okay, and they're now in close proximity, there will be a particular temperature and a particular pressure where this stuff will react. These guys here will say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and start combining with it. Now, what happens if you take a little bit of kerosene and you put a little line over here of kerosene or gas, and you take a lighter and you light it over here. What have anybody seen that? You have a fire that starts over here and quickly moves over here. I don't know if you guys as kids did. I did this all the time. See how far I can go around the corners and stuff like that. And what was happening was that if you have a bunch of these guys over here, and if you put an ignition source over here, that ignition source has temperature. So what it does is that for the pressure that this thing is at, it is probably going to generate enough local temperature to where at that pressure it will actually react with this guy right here. And then these two guys are going to have a flame front that is going to generate enough temperature to move this way. You see what I'm talking about? So that is called controlled combustion. Controlled combustion is something that starts at one end and propagates over to the other end. Well, think about it. If this is inside of a chamber, okay? If this is inside of a chamber, like the chamber that's inside of our combustion chamber over here, if we start the fire right here, what is going to happen to the pressure if this thing is moving this way? It goes up, right? And what's going to happen to the temperature? Even for the stuff that's not burned, it goes up, right? So it is possible for the pressure and the temperature over here to reach the value where this stuff here, which hasn't been able to be burned by this combustion front over here, reacts all at once. That is called detonation, okay? Detonation is an explosion. It's not a controlled combustion. And one of the things that we need to avoid in our airplane engines is detonation. Because if you have something that moves over here, maybe it's just this part of the combustion chamber gets squished together to where the temperature and the pressure at that point reach the point where all of these things at the same time, as opposed to one next to the other, next to the other, next to the other, all of them will burn. And when they all burn, guess what happens? It's like the pressure really, really spikes. It's like taking a hammer then, and the hammer is going to try to, put a spike on this thing here. Any questions about that? So anytime pressure increases, temperature also increases. Those are the things we got to remember. Okay, those two things go together. We don't want to have detonation. Now, if we have a mixture like this, where let's say that independently of this one here, if we reach a temperature and a pressure, all this mixture, before we even started any flame whatsoever, where all this mixture instantaneously combusts, then we have detonation over the entire thing. I don't know, has anybody ever had a car where you were driving up an incline and maybe you had the throttle quite open and you hear the thing kind of like sounding like bells, like clink, clink, clink?
Knock sensor.
Knock sensor, okay. So that's what knock is. Now, you can hear knock. When you can hear knock, that's bad news. And the reason why it is bad news is really simple. Controlled combustion, and I'll come back to some of these things there.
Well, pre-ignition, right? Pre-ignition.
Well, almost, yeah. Let me get back to that, okay? If you look at a timeline, and let's say that this is time of we start looking at it right here. If you start an ignition process right here, let's say you gave it some spark, and all this thing is burning over, just like I did with my fuel. I started it over here and started moving over here. What's going to happen is that this thing is going to propagate over there and reach a maximum where all of this stuff is burned. This is pressure, right? I'm sorry. All of this stuff is burned, and after that, it's going to start decaying. And in an internal combustion engine, you take care of this. This is what's going to push your piston down. You want this guy right here to be pushed down by this right here. That's what you want, okay? Now what happens is that if you have something that starts off like this, and I'm going to use a different color. If you reach detonation somewhere over here, what's going to happen is that this thing is going to go like this, and then decay like that. And your piston needs a constant pressure to push it down. If you take a hammer and you hit it, it's also a force moving it down. But the piston is not able to transfer that force into the crank for power. It just takes the blow. It's like somebody takes you. If somebody takes you and pushes you, you know, maybe you move to one side. But if somebody comes in and hits you, maybe you're not moving. You're just going to take the damage, and that's exactly what happens in internal combustion. And so you don't want detonation. Now, the one thing I wanted to say was that this point right here, on 99.9% of any engine, whether it's a race engine, your truck engine, your airplane engine, has to be around 12 degrees after top dead center. Top dead center is the point where this piston goes at the very maximum. That's dead center, top dead center. So 12 degrees after top dead center, this piston is barely going down. That is the point where you're able to take advantage of the most work that is out here. Well, let's think about it. If you have a lot of mixture in there because you have the throttle fully open and therefore the outside air comes in, then this peak right here is going to be a little bit higher than if you don't have a lot of mixture in it. So if you have less mixture in it, guess what happens? This guy is going to be like this. Not only does it not get that high, but this point right here happens at a different time. Okay? And that is relevant for us. And I will come back when we talk about mixtures about these things. Okay? Now, we talked about detonation a little bit. We don't want detonation like this, right? When do we think that we're going to have the highest probability of detonation?
Lean mixture.
Okay, lean mixture. Anybody else have any thoughts? Remember, any combination of temperature and pressure where the stuff will react, that's when this happens. When will it happen? When we have the highest pressure, which will have the highest temperature. When do we have the highest pressure? When the throttle is fully open and we take all of the pressure we can and put it into the engine. Right? Because we said over here, what you're doing with your throttle is you're throttling something that allows the outside air, and I'm going to say plus fuel, to get into your engine. This is your throttle cable. And when you open it fully open, you allow all of the outside air to go in. Well, when is the outside air the highest? When you're at ground level. 2 inches for every 1,000 feet, right guys? Mm-hmm. So at 20,000 feet, are we going to have the same amount of outside air?
No.
No. So is the probability of us having a higher pressure and higher temperature at 20,000 feet the same as it's not. So this is the stuff we got to keep in mind, okay? And the reason why is because it's going to be relevant later on in how we suppress this one. Okay. Let's take a moment and step back and talk a little bit about these pieces of fuel and pieces of air out there. There is a certain number of units of air that are required to burn a unit of fuel. In regular avgas, it's 14 14.8 to 1. That means you need 14.8 ounces of air to be able to completely burn 1 ounce of fuel. This is called stoichiometric. Okay, and what that does is, what that says is that if every one of these guys finds the corresponding number of air pieces over here, all of these guys are going to be burned. Well, let's just say that you have more fuel than 14.8 to 1. That means that you have, this is air, this is fuel. Okay, for 1 part of fuel you need 14.8 parts of air. So this is called stoichiometric. Then there's something that you're gonna hear people say, well, I have a rich mixture, or I have a lean mixture. Rich refers to something that has more fuel than stoichiometric. Lean refers to you having less fuel than stoichiometric. Well, let's take a rich mixture, 12.5 to 1. Okay? So now what's happening is that you got a few extra of these guys in here. Not enough to find, there's not enough air to burn these guys. But what do you think happens to these guys?
They remain unburned.
They remain unburned. They go for a ride. But they have to go to the same temperature as the rest of the gases in there, right? They're not contributing to this combustion process, but they're being heated up. Well, the energy that is required to heat these guys up is energy that is not available for pushing the piston down. Okay? Alright, so the energy that is required to heat these guys up without them contributing cools this whole thing here. So this, whenever you have a rich mixture, you cool the combustion process. Okay? Well, let's go back and say, what happens if you have more air than you have fuel in here? Let's say 15.5 to 1.
It's too lean.
This is lean, okay? Okay, can somebody tell me what you think may happen if this is lean?
And melt valves.
No, actually don't, believe it or not. The same thing happens that happens over here. The challenge is that you have more air, then there's some of these air guys are not going to find a corresponding fuel piece to react with. So what happens to this air? It goes along for the ride, it takes energy to get heated up. It actually cools the mixture. The challenge that we have, so this also cools the mixture. Okay? So what that means is that when we are stoichiometric, we will have the highest temperature. And when we are rich, we will have a temperature that is lower than the highest temperature. And when we're lean, we have a temperature that is lower than the highest temperature. Right? Because the extra air had to go along for the ride, had to be heated up, or the extra fuel had to go for the ride, had to be heated up. Well, this is what happens then. I said before that every engine prefers to be at 12 degrees after top dead center. So this piston is getting pushed down, and at some point over here, the exhaust valve opens. So okay, what you see when you have an engine analyzer, and I'll talk about engine analyzers later on, you will see the temperature that corresponds to this point right here. Okay? Now, let's say that you have this event right here. You were not able to absorb this amount of energy in terms of the piston. The piston got a hit. It wasn't able to transfer it into your shaft to turn your propeller. So it just generated heat on the aluminum of the piston. Believe it or not, you leave little craters in it. You know, it's really kind of bad. It's like taking a hammer and hitting this thing. Well, what you're going to see is you're going to see an exhaust temperature that is different. But yet what you're also going to see is this energy has to go somewhere. It either has to go in the exhaust, or it has to go into your propeller, Well, where else can it go?
Deform the piston.
It can deform the piston, or it can be transferred to the cylinders, and what you're going to see is you're going to have a cylinder temperature that is going to go up. So keep that in mind, because I'm going to go back and talk about this a little bit. Whenever you have detonation, you see an exhaust temperature going down and cylinder head temperatures going up. Whenever you see that, get back into some rich mixture, because that is the safe mixture to be cool. We talked a little bit about being able to be cool when it's lean, but as Gary correctly figured out, being lean is a tricky mixture to manage. Unless you know exactly where you are in the lean process, you may think that you're cooling a cylinder, but you may actually have one of the cylinders that is detonating. Yes, sir.
Now, so can we go to that graph on,
Sure.
I think, the next page? Right. Now, we're running predominantly 4-cylinder or 6-cylinder engines.
Yep.
Each cylinder is not going to be running along the same timeline for that
That's exactly right.
pressure, right? So if you get one cylinder lean, or you get it, say you want to run it at peak temperature for some reason, then the others may not be.
That's absolutely right. And that's exactly what we need to understand. That's why I'm trying to, start from the very process. Each cylinder is having its own dance, right? One may be rich, the other one may be lean at the same time, because maybe the manifold that goes from the carburetor over to the first cylinder, that's the one that's right there, it gets maybe a little bit more mixture, and the other one has to go all the way around, has to go turn 90 degrees and then go up. Well, guess what? That one's probably not going to get the same amount of mixture. So you may have a different curve for each cylinder. And you got to make sure that all 4 cylinders or all 6 cylinders, or however many cylinders you're going to have in your airplane, are still doing okay. So you got to keep that in mind. But let's give me 5 minutes and we'll get into that. I just wanted you to know that when you see, if you have an engine analyzer, when you see exhaust temperatures on any one cylinder all of a sudden drop and cylinder head temperatures spike up, and we're talking about 30 to 40 degrees, you detonate. Put it on full rich and start your mixture adjusting again, because that is not good. Continuous detonation on this kind of detonation, you will destroy an engine in 300 to 400 hours. So this kind of stuff right here, you can actually get home and you probably won't know it, and next year it's going to bite you in the butt. Detonation of the whole mixture, the whole thing, when everything spikes at once, that will destroy an engine in about an hour and a half. So you can be coming back from Myrtle Beach, and you can have a bad day, if you don't catch this, So that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid detonation. This whole discussion here is so that we understand detonation stuff. We want to make sure that we understand when it's happening or when it can happen. Okay? Yes, sir?
Yeah, what are the symptoms of detonation? What would be the symptoms?
What are the symptoms?
The symptoms are that you have exhaust, if you have normal exhaust gas temperatures, if you start seeing exhaust gas temperatures that drop and cylinder head temperatures that increase, that's detonation.
What if you don't have an analyzer?
Then you need to make sure that you stay away from the conditions that can lead to detonation. And that's what you want to do, frankly. I just want you to know that it's better to be safe than have a problem. And unless you really understand your engine really well, you don't want to do what I do. I operate my engines here. But that's only because I know exactly what each cylinder is doing and where it's doing. What I want you to do is I want you to operate your engines right here. And we'll talk a little bit about how to make sure you stay away from detonation. So Bernie, your point is well taken. If you can't really tell what's happening, let's make sure that we have circumstances that we're operating in that allow us to stay away from trouble. Okay?
And now on Sparky, we've got just one EGT.
Right.
That's the only engine information we have outside of the oil pressure, say. And,
Yeah.
And so we don't know what's going on in any one of the cylinders, actually.
That is correct. And let me give you guys some recommendations over here, because it is not as bad as I'm making to happen. Okay? We were talking about.
Unless your engine stops.
Well, and you know what? Don't be afraid of your engine. Don't be. What you got to do is you got to get comfortable with your engine. You got to understand when is it doing what. And this is something that, you know, if you start coughing, don't assume the thing's going to quit. You got to understand why it's coughing, okay? And this is what happens. Detonation happens whenever you have the highest fill. That happens when you're on the ground, when you're just taking off. Once you get up in altitude and you have less than 100% fuel, the chances of detonation are very, very small. In fact, if you are at less than 70% power, remember that, less than 70% power. That's one number you got to put on side. If you are at less than 70% power, detonation is almost impossible to do. So, you know, you're flying along, you know that, you know, at the ground, if you were at sea level, there's 30 inches of vacuum. What's less than 70% power, Paul, if we go and have it at full throttle? Can anybody figure that out? What's the manifold pressure that you may need? What's the altitude that corresponds to less than 70% power? Well, let's take 30 inches and multiply it by 70%. That's 21 inches. So if you're at an altitude where the atmospheric pressure is 21 inches or less, the chances of getting detonation is 0. That's when you can start playing around with the stuff.
Well, that's around 8,000 or 9,000 feet, would you say?
Yep.
And well, even Sparky doesn't go there.
Yeah, but you may have a 172 that can go 9,000 feet.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say that you're at 4,000 feet.
Right.
So that's about 21 inches, that's like 25 or 26 inches. So what you got to do is, you can't give it full throttle unless you are in the stoichiometrically rich zone. Okay? As long as you are in the stoichiometrically rich zone, you're cooling this down. The cooling is going to reduce the temperature that corresponds to the pressure for it to detonate, and that's what's going to keep it from detonating. Okay? Remember, temperature, pressure go the same, so as long as you keep the temperatures down, it's not going to detonate. The way you keep it from detonating it, you keep it rich, as long as you have it full throttle. But if you start maybe pulling the throttle back because you want to go, you know, somewhere for a couple of hours and you don't need to have it at full throttle, then that means that you may be way below 70% power. Look at your operating handbook and it tells you at 2,450 RPMs, you know, it's this percent power, and as long as you are below 70%, you can start playing with the mixture as much as you want to. You can go from here to here and you're not going to detonate. But it got to be below 70%.
So if you're climbing, it's got to be full rich. And if you're leveling off and cruising, you can lean it.
As long as you are less than 70%, yeah. I mean, for those of you guys that will fly turbocharged airplanes, it's a totally different game. But we'll do it on a different talk. You know, the turbocharged aspects are a little bit different. Okay, so what we said was that, you know, obviously each cylinder has its own signature, right? So let's talk about this a little bit. Let's say that we have 4 cylinders. So we got cylinder number 1, and cylinder number 2, and cylinder number 3, and cylinder number 4. Believe it or not, these things are all offset a little bit, and they're counted, you know, in sequence by the crankshaft throws that they're connected to, okay? And so you take off, and you have, let's say that you have exhaust temperatures, and you have cylinder head temperatures. And let's just say for right now that we have all 4 of them, but I know that you only have 1 in Sparky. So we'll get back to the Sparkies of the world in just a second. Well, what you're going to see is, you're going to see that and you take off at full fuel, right? So fuel flow is going to be as much max as possible, and I think Sparky is probably going to use about 13 gallons an hour or something, maybe 14 gallons an hour.
Oh,
full fuel?
10.
No.
Well, at full power, it's probably 10 gallons.
Okay,
It's
let's say
100
10.
horsepower, so it's probably about 10 gallons.
10, let's make it 10, okay?
Yeah.
So you got 10 gallons an hour. So at 10 gallons an hour, you say, well, where's number 1 over here? Well, guess what? Number 1 may be at 1505. Yes, number 1. So you got a meter that tells you the number 1 temperature is at 1505. Okay, you look at number 2, Number 2 may be at, you know, so this is 1505 right here, and number 2 is going to be 1450, and number 3 is going to be in between, and so forth and so on. So you're going to have 4 points over here. Each one of them corresponds to a particular temperature. Well, what's going to happen? Remember, what is the highest temperature mixture? When does it happen?
That's stoichiometric.
It's stoichiometric. So, if I start, and right now when I take off, I am what? I'm rich or lean?
Rich.
I'm on the rich side of stoichiometric. So if I start pulling back fuel over here, if I start taking the red knob and start pulling it back, what I'm doing is I am reducing the amount of fuel, and the air stays the same, because the air is being drawn in by this piston that goes up and down, right? And, you know, the piston is going up and down just like it was before. It's just that I'm going to put less fuel into it. Well, what do you think is going to happen to these temperatures? You guys think it's going to go down, or you think it's going to go up? Who wants to have an opening bid?
As you lean it out, it's going to go up.
It's going to go up. It's going to go up because it's going to go towards stoichiometric. Right? Okay, so let's take number 1. Number 1 is going to start going, yeah, like this. And what about number 2? Same thing, right? And when do we know that the first of those 4 cylinders reaches stoichiometric? When do we know that? Yeah.
When the RPM slightly drops and then you adjust the fuel mixture a couple of turns? You watch for a decrease in RPM, right?
That's almost. What you do is, if you have an engine analyzer that allows you to track this, whenever you reach a temperature that starts going back down, that means that this cylinder reached stoichiometric right there, right? And that could be, it could be that this guy keeps going. You know? And then maybe this guy reaches stoichiometric and starts going back down. Because we determined that stoichiometric is the highest temperature. Right? Now, what you want to do is, if you want to be on the rich side of stoichiometric, you want to take the cylinder that is the very closest to stoichiometric and keep it safe from stoichiometric so we don't detonate, right? You know. So, who cares if the other ones are even richer? We just need to catch the first one, because the first one is the one that is the closest.
Right.
This may be this one here. Interestingly, it does not need to be the hottest one. And that is a misconception. If you talk to 10 pilots out there, I guarantee you that 9 out of 10 are going to tell you, you look at the hottest cylinder, and that's the one that you lean on. It's a fallacy. It's a fallacy, because it does not necessarily need to be the hottest one. It could very well be that the hottest one is the hottest because it's the first one next to the carburetor, and he was able to catch all the good air coming in, and the one at the end didn't get as much, and, you know, he was a little bit leaner. So it is the first one to peak. That's what we need to know.
And that peak might be lower than the peaks of other cylinders.
Correct. And what happens is that it is always going to be this one. Whenever you have an airplane, it is probably always going to be this particular cylinder that peaks first. So when you have an airplane that has one particular cylinder that is susceptible to be the lean one, then that's the one that you put the exhaust temperature, and that's why Sparkly only has one. That's why Sparkly probably only has one exhaust gas temperature, and somebody figured out from Continental that cylinder number 3 was the first one to reach peak, so that's the one that they put the exhaust temperature, because all the other ones were richer than that. Yeah?
You know, I meant to check before the meeting started. I don't know where the EGT probe is in Sparky. And if it's in the exhaust pipe,
Yep.
then that doesn't tell us which cylinder is reaching stoichiometry first.
It does not.
It's right on the stack, though, coming out of the cylinder.
Is
Of
that
one,
what it is?
of one cylinder, right?
Yeah, it's on the stack, just right after the flange.
So it's not where it mixes together, but it is where one cylinder exhausts and then that exhaust mixes with the rest.
So it is sensing one cylinder, one specific
That's correct.
cylinder.
Yeah.
One
Okay.
cylinder
One
exhaust
mixture.
coming through.
And then the engine manufacturers determine that that's the cylinder
Most
that
likely.
reaches peak first.
Most likely to be the one that reaches peak first.
Okay.
So if this is the one that reaches peak first, in 99.9% of the Continental 200A or Continental 200Bs, that's the one you monitor. Okay? Now let me tell you what happens though, to your point, is that once it starts getting rough, because what happens is that you can get to peak and it's running perfect. All these other, this guy is still away from peak, right? This particular guy here, when this reaches peak, it's still quite a bit rich from peak. Maybe the next guy is even richer from peak. If we were to take, I'm just gonna paint this one here like this. If this one was to do this right here, well, that one is really rich from peak when this one reaches peak, right? Well, a lot of times, when we pull this out, we start riding this temperature down, and we get to the point where the mixture is so lean that it is very difficult to ignite. A very lean mixture is 5 times more difficult to ignite than a slightly rich mixture. 5 times more difficult. So your ignition system is going to go, hey man, I would like to go ahead and light this thing up. Let's say that you're down here. Let's say that you're down here, you got this down, and guess what happens is it sends the voltage to the spark plug. The spark plug goes through you. I'm not going to go ahead and send a spark over there. So that particular combustion event did not happen. And the piston goes down, and it empties out. It empties, it didn't make any power obviously because it didn't have the rise out there. And as it empties it out, it finds all these other gases that are nice and hot, and a lot of times that ignites, So you hear a little popping noise, So not only are you losing power because you're now running on 3 cylinders as opposed to 4 cylinders, but you're also maybe hearing some popping noises that go along with it. And that's the rough part that you mentioned. Now, as long as you're running at less than 70% power, it is okay to get all the way to rough. Frankly, that's how I fly 20197. I don't care if the thing gets rough because I know I'm never at 100% power. I know that I'm always at less than 70% power, so what I do is I lean this thing here until it starts getting rough, and then I put a little bit more mixture in there to where it's not rough, and then it's okay. Any questions about that point?
And is the point of it fuel conservation?
The point of it is fuel conservation to be able to give you range.
Okay.
You got to remember, I don't know, let's say you got, I don't know how much spark is. Let's say you have 20 gallons in Sparky, or maybe a little bit.
It's close.
So if you have 20 gallons in Sparky and you can get the fuel down to 5 gallons per hour, and we said that this was 10 gallons per hour, well guess what? You're going to be going, roughly speaking, 4 hours, and over here you're just going to be going 2 hours. So if you need to get somewhere, and most of us need to get somewhere when we're flying stuff, range becomes an issue. Okay, 70% or less. Is that clear in everybody's mind? I want you guys to have that like stamped on the side of your
Okay,
head.
and when you mentioned the manifold pressure down to 21 inches would give you 70% typically, we don't have a manifold pressure gauge. All we've got is a tack that's going to tell us that. So we've got to look in the POH to see
Yep.
70% is this much RPM.
Yep. What you want to do is you want to familiarize yourself with your particular engine/airplane configuration and figure out which combinations are you always going to be below 70%. And at those combinations you can play all you want here. Okay? You're not going to hurt anything. Yeah.
So you're saying temperature is no factor?
I'm saying-
Exhaust gas temperature is no factor. You're not going to melt valves and
Nope.
pistons and...
You're going to melt valves. The answer is you're going to melt valves if you operate at peak with a high loading. You can melt valves if you operate at peak with a high loading. But you're not going to detonate. You're not going to detonate, which is the stuff that will literally can kill your engine in 2 hours. Okay? If you're going to have an exhaust valve that is seeing prolonged temperatures, like I can speak from experience there. If you have an exhaust valve, one of these guys right here, that is seeing extremely high temperatures for a prolonged period of time, you're going to have what's called metal fatigue that is going to happen, and this metal is going to say, hey, you know, instead of lasting 2,000 hours, I'm just going to go ahead and start rupturing maybe at 1,000 hours or 1,500 hours.
So when my new top end was put on, I was told to watch temperatures
Mm-hmm.
in the leaning process.
Yep.
That's a fallacy. That's not correct.
Yep. Let's talk about this for a second, okay? I'll come back to this, okay? If you have an engine like Sparky has a Continental O200A or O200B.
It's an A.
An A? Okay. So O200A. An O200A has a 7-to-1 compression ratio. What that means is that this piston, this volume, when the piston is all the way at the bottom, compared to the volume when the piston is at the top, is 7 times bigger than this right here. Okay? Now remember what I said is when pressure goes up, what happens to temperature? Okay. Right.
We got that far.
All right. So the other thing that happens is that if you have a higher compression ratio, like you have an O360, a Lycoming O360, which has an 8.5 to 1. Okay? So Chuck has, this is a Continental, and this is a Lycoming. You have an O360, and that is 8.5 to 1 compression ratio. You know? So the question, why is that relevant? Here's why it's relevant. If you have a low compression ratio, then this curve right here is relatively, I'm exaggerating, like this. If you have a high compression ratio and you burn it and you start the ignition process, this curve is like this. Okay? As a result of it, if the valve on the exhaust opens at the same time, and they pretty much do, on the O360, you're gonna see a lower temperature, everything else being equal, than you will on the O200. Is this good or bad? It's just the nature of the beast, because you had a curve over here, and the gases were not able to produce as much, you know, they were just slow in expanding, so by the time the valve opened, they were just still hot. So a low compression engine will always have a higher exhaust temperature than a high compression engine. And here's the, you know, like somebody says, look, I've been flying an engine, I noticed Sparky gets to 1,520 or whatever the temperature is, and you know, somebody says, well, maybe it's okay to go to 1,520. Well, it is if you have a 7-to-1 compression ratio. It is not if you have an 8.5 to 1 compression ratio. So if you're seeing temperatures in an O360 that are similar to the temperatures in a Continental O200, you probably are operating much closer to the peak than you really need to be. Okay?
Well,
So,
I was told,
oh, sorry.
Yes, right.
I was told stay under 1,400 exhaust gas temperature.
Okay. What I would do is I would say, hey, look, that's great, man. Let's figure out what happens. Figure out where this temperature is. It's not about the value of the temperature. It's about how close you are to the peak. And most importantly, it is how close you are to the peak that is the closest to stoichiometric. So you got to figure out which one is the closest to stoichiometric. If in 9 out of 10 airplanes that have 4-cylinder engines, there's usually one cylinder that is the closest to the peak. It always is, you know, I think it's number 3, you know, for some reason it just takes a while. So if that is the case, then you want to find out where this peaks. And as long as you're less than 70% power, bring it out, figure out, you see the temperature go up, you start seeing the temperature come back down. And remember what your fuel, you know, about the position of your fuel flow was, that is peak. You do not want to operate at peak, I can tell you that much. You do not want to operate at peak. You need to cool these things down. You need to cool them down either by having more fuel than what you need, or by having substantially less fuel than what you need. This is the lean of peak method, okay? How much is okay to be less than peak? So if this is peak, you don't want to operate at peak. That means you got to go back out here. Well, how much is good? Anybody have any thoughts?
50 degrees.
Okay.
On that last graph, was it the same axes, temperature, and fuel flow?
This is the pressure inside the cylinder, and this is degrees of crank. Degrees of crank rotated.
Okay.
In other words, the piston, this is top dead center, this is like right here, and this starts going down, and this is where the exhaust valve opens, and this is just how much this thing moved down.
Okay.
And then the exhaust valve opens, once the exhaust valve opens, whatever's trapped in there gets out, at whatever temperature it's in there.
So it's pressure.
Okay? So if you have a higher compression engine, you're going to have stuff here that is going to be at a lower temperature. It's kind of like counterintuitive. You think higher compression, higher temperature. Not the case. Okay? Like a Skyhawk. You know, most Skyhawks have a Lycoming 0320. It's 71 compression ratio, and at 70% power, you may be running 1480, 1490. So what? I fly, a Mooney with, with a big engine, and I have exhaust gas temperatures of 1580, 1590. And I don't care because I know that I'm 60, 70 degrees rich of peak. And I found out what the peak was. And as long as I'm 50 degrees rich of peak, I'm okay. Okay, so it's more making sure that you have the mixture being rich and being away from peak than it is the actual exhaust temperature. And interestingly enough, it's not really the valve that is hurting there, it's just that the entire process that is being at a lower temperature if you have a rich mixture out there. Okay? So, what are good targets? So you're cruising around, you got Sparky up there, and for cruise, some people said 50 degrees, rich of peak, ROP, okay? If you ask, for example, somebody that spends a lot of time working on these guys, like Kurt at Moyer, he'll tell you running 100 degrees rich, okay? So some people say 100 degrees rich of peak. I can tell you that if you are running above 70%, you're okay as long as you're 100 degrees rich of peak. So this is for above 70%. Let's say 70 to 85%. Okay. If you're running at 85 to 90%, and this is including turbocharged, you want 120 degrees rich of peak. That's all it is, just to keep this thing cool. Okay. And this is for about 70%. And this is percent power. Now, let's say that you're running at 50% power. If I was running at 50% power, I would run it as lean as I could get away with. Because it doesn't matter. Even as long as the thing fires on all cylinders, as long as it doesn't get rough, you're not going to have detonation. You're not going to have enough mixture in there to do any damage. There's only half of the mixture, right? Even if you have it firewalled, but you're very, very high. So you run it as lean as you can because it doesn't make any difference. You can run it. Peak is okay. But it only is okay when you have this. Why is it okay when you have that? Because you don't have enough power, you don't have enough energy in there to do damage to your engine. That's the whole thing, you know. You just don't want the air-fuel mixture in there to create so much temperature that your stuff is going to start falling apart. Okay, so quick quiz. What is it that we want to avoid for sure?
Detonation.
Detonation, okay. You succeeded. That's an important one. Okay. The second one is, if you want to lean an engine, what do you want to lean to? What is the criteria for leaning this engine? You want to figure out where the peak is, and then you want to go ahead and go, I'm going to suggest go richer peak. We'll have another session on how to operate leaner peak, okay? It's an entire different criteria. Because, I'll tell you in a minute why, I can tell you why. If this is the peak, and you got one cylinder that reaches this peak first, that means that all the other cylinders are going to reach the peak later, right? That means that they are richer than this one.
Right.
Okay? Well, if you want to operate leaner peak, you need to get on the other side of this, and guess which cylinder it is that you're looking at? You're looking at the very last cylinder that goes to peak. So what you do is, you do this right here, and let's say that this cylinder goes over here and peaks right here. Guess which one is the one that you're looking at? You're looking at this cylinder. But you need an engine analyzer for that. And some of you guys are going to be flying in an airplane that has an engine analyzer. In fact, a recommendation from an engineer to you guys is, let's see if we can get an engine analyzer in your next airplane. Because it is a good practice. It is going to give you a lot of insight on what is happening. And someday, you're going to be flying an airplane that has an engine analyzer. And as long as you have it, it's good to know what is happening. So when you're running richer peak, you find the first one that peaks, or you find the one that peaks, and then you go ahead and take that temperature and you add how much to it? 50 degrees? 50 degrees as long as it is.
Depends where you are in your power range.
50 degrees as long as you're around 70%. Looks like our props are going down here, guys, so just bear with me. There's too much excitement going on over here. If you run full power, for example, some of you guys are going to have turbocharged airplanes. If you run full power, you can run full power all the way up to 18, 20,000 feet up there. You want to make sure that you stay in a safe zone over here. That, maybe 100 degrees feet. Any questions? Are we more confused now than we were before, guys?
No, this is good. This is good.
A little bit, right?
No, it's interesting.
Can I ask a specific question
Absolutely.
about an issue we had with Sparky? We had just one EGT, and it's been running warmer than it usually does,
Right.
the EGT.
Okay.
And it's probably running about 100 degrees rich at peak. When
Okay.
you're at full power and you're climbing up. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
No,
You
it's,
said that the EGT goes up, right?
yeah, the EGT goes up, it doesn't go up to peak.
Oh, okay.
It goes up to
Oh, rich
about
peak, right.
100 degrees
Right.
rich at peak.
Mhm.
But in the past, when we first got Sparky, it didn't run that hot. I
Right.
mean, it did on takeoff. What would you suggest is an issue with it?
Okay. It could be a couple things, and let's reason our way into it, because I think we can actually reason our way into it. Okay. Let me see if I can find. Okay, I'll make another one. So here's my famous graph, and I'm going to do the same curve out there. Okay. If you have the spark plug over here and the spark plug over here, what's going to happen is, if you ignite both of these guys at the same time, you're going to have like rings of combustion that go out like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And once these join, then they just kind of like go like this. All right. What happens if one of these spark plugs is not firing? So you only have rings from this guy, and they have to go all the way over here.
It's longer.
It takes a lot longer. So if you have two spark plugs, you may have a curve like this. If you only have one spark plug, you may have a curve like this. Okay? And since we know that the exhaust valve opens at the same time, what do we think is going to happen to the exhaust temperature if one spark plug is not firing?
It's going to be higher.
It's going to be higher. Now, I challenge you, next time you take Sparky out there and you go out there and do your run-up, and then look at the exhaust temperature, and you put it on one mag, and that exhaust temperature will go up a little bit. It should. If it doesn't go up, then your exhaust temperature is not reading, is not accurate or not sensitive enough. but it really should go up, okay? So, what can it be? It can be a spark plug that, once it's loaded up, may not be really firing. Maybe just one of them, okay? It could also be that maybe you have a little piece of, you know, some little trash or something that got in between where the jet is, and now the same carburetor setting that had a certain orifice that allowed fuel to get in, maybe that orifice is now a little bit blocked, and now there's a little bit less fuel going in. Because that will have the effect of a lean mixture, which is different, right? You know, lean mixture just means that, you know, it just burns slow, you know. Now let's talk a little bit about spark plugs, because I think this is something that I see all the time. And here's a spark plug. I'm going to paint it big so that you can see what's happening over here. What a spark plug is. This is the inside of a spark plug. A spark plug is something that has an electrode on the center, and it has a ground electrode on the outside, and what you do is you apply a voltage across it, and if this voltage is high enough, it will ionize the air, and it will literally create a spark between this electrode and this electrode. Okay? Now, remember earlier on I said that when we're talking about burning stuff, we're talking about hydrocarbon, okay? Carbon. The carbon atom is inside of the hydrocarbons. A spark plug is designed to be able to clean itself from any carbon that may be accumulating over here. But in order to clean itself, it needs a temperature of 1200 degrees Celsius. That's 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so the temperature that is needed in order to take a piece of carbon and literally make this piece of carbon burn as part of the fuel is 1200 C, give or take. So, what the spark plug manufacturers do is they say, look, I'm going to have a certain insulation over here that will allow this part right here to be hot enough to where it is operating periodically 1200 degrees C. But only periodically, because otherwise you're going to start, you know, having this too hot. Have any of you guys ever heard of cold spark plugs and hot spark plugs? Okay, so the difference between a cold spark plug and a hot spark plug is that you have more and less of this insulation out here. And the more insulation you have, the less heat can be carried out by, you know, by this electrode over here, the higher this temperature is going to be. Now what happens is that when you sit on the tarmac over here and you try to put your flight plan in, or you try to look at your iPad, you have this thing running. What do you think happens to those temperatures inside of this combustion process? No, they're very low, right? I mean, this thing is just idling. It's not very, very, very high. And what happens is that you may have fuel particles that will start caking on here, and this cakes on here, and it is like it's carbon. Well, guess what? Carbon is conductive. So it conducts electricity. So there comes a point where you apply a voltage over here, and this voltage, instead of jumping across this gap and generating a spark, finds a path across this carbon to ground. Because this is ground right here. This is all connected by this is ground right here. This is not connected. This is ground. This is ground. This is ground. So this is called fouling the spark plug. When does fouling the spark plug happen? When this stuff is cold. When is the stuff cold? When there's no load on it. When you're sitting there idling. So what I would recommend to people is when you sit there and idle, if you can, lean the mixture. Even lean it to where the thing starts getting rough, and then put it in just a little bit. It will keep the stuff from forming on the spark plugs. But there's one thing you got to keep in mind, guys. And I'm saying that because I've done it. You got to add to your checklist that you put the mixture back on full. Right. Let me say it one more time. You got to add it to your checklist that the mixture is full rich. Okay? You gotta add it to your checklist. You gotta add it to your checklist. Detonation and adding it to your checklist to take off in full rates is absolutely mandatory. Why is it mandatory? Because you can actually take off with the thing lean, and then you're gonna be in real trouble. And this is exactly when you need the most power, and you need the least amount of problems. So, when you're just taxiing around, if you can, lean it. By leaning it up, there's not going to be enough carbon built in there because there's not enough fuel available to build carbon. You're not going to foul the spark plugs. And your spark plugs are going to last a lot longer.
And when you're just taxiing around, you're clearly under 50% power.
You're like probably 15% power. 15% power and not really, contributing to that.
I would think that's a fairly common issue with training planes then, because you spend a lot more time sitting on the ground talking than we actually have somewhere to go.
It is. I think that, I would say that not just training planes, I would say that at least 50% of general aviation airplanes experience this problem. The only reason why they don't get in trouble is because most guys that fly them, once they take off, this stuff gets so hot that it actually burns it up. But if you're just going around the pattern and going around the pattern, it just may not get hot enough to where it burns off, and then you start having foul spark plugs. Good point. I'm glad you reminded me of that. Any other questions, guys? Yes, sir.
How do you calculate your 70% power setting? Do you do it by RPM?
I would recommend look at your,
Well, it'll tell you, so it tells in the manual 75, 65, 55. It
Yeah.
doesn't really give you 70%. And there's quite a bit of RPM difference from 75 to 65.
yeah.
So how,
The answer is there's a way to calculate it, and an engine analyzer that is mounted in your airplane has that capability. Every engine analyzer has it, whether you have JPI, Electronics International, whatever it is, and it tells you you're at 70% power, 65% power. But in order to be safe, make sure that you look at, and it is a combination. It's not just one value. It depends on how high you are and what the RPMs are, and whether, because you could be firewalled at 9,000 feet and you're less than 70% power. Firewall, right? It doesn't matter, So the answer is, I hate to say it, but you got to look at your manual, man.
But I mean, should you pick 75 or 65 or?
I would pick 65. You want to be below 70, so pick 65. And once you're at 65, you can do whatever you want to. You're not going to hurt your engine. You can make it cough. Once it coughs, don't worry about it. If you put the mixture back in, it'll come back.
You don't ever run Sparky below.
Sparky is like all the yeah, and your point's well taken. Your point's well taken is that maybe for Sparky, it is more than 70% all the time. It's not relevant. But maybe at some point in time you're going to be flying something else, and that something else you can't fly at 100%.
Yeah, even I think what you're reflecting on, Tony, is you firewall it for takeoff, but that isn't 100% power here on the field. That might only be 80% power here on the field, 80% of what its maximum is. And you get to 4,000 feet, you could have a firewall and be under 70% power. So that's Otto. I like what Otto said, which is you got to look at the POH and see what it says for the amount of power, for the RPMs you're running, and the density altitude, and see what it tells you for your percent power. It's in the handbook, and I'll be happy to go over that with you.
Okay.
The worst thing that I could think of for this entire lecture is my husband here. Now he really, the excuse that he makes me when he says I'm cleaning the spark plugs is true! I can't even yell at him anymore. I just lost, my whole thing just fell apart. There you go.
I'm sure Otto will stick around for a few minutes if anybody wants to have some other conversation. Thank you very much.